In 1945, as World War II drew to its brutal end, American troops entered Manchuria and stumbled upon a nightmare the world was never meant to see. Hidden in an abandoned complex were Japan's secret laboratories, rooms filled with strange equipment, charts written in Japanese, and evidence of human experiments unlike anything in history. It was a discovery so horrific that the U.S. military sealed the files, trading silence for scientific data. For decades, the truth remained buried, until now. This is the true story of the American investigators who uncovered Japan's darkest secret and the moral compromise that followed. Every detail is verified. Every moment honors the victims. This is history that must never be forgotten. This true story matters. If you believe in historical truth, subscribe, hit like, and turn on notifications. Share this important story. Comment: should justice ever be compromised? Act 1. The Discovery. Scene 1. August 1945. The end of empire. The thunderous roar of Soviet artillery echoed across the Manchurian plains as dawn broke on August 9, 1945. Operation August Storm had begun. The massive Soviet invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria, involving over 1.5 million troops in what would become one of history's most decisive military campaigns. For Japan, already reeling from atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima 3 days earlier, the Soviet assault was catastrophic. The supposedly impregnable Kwantung Army, once Japan's most elite fighting force, crumbled within days. Japanese commanders, unprepared for the ferocity and speed of the Soviet advance, ordered chaotic evacuations of personnel and equipment. Among those desperately fleeing were the staff of a facility near Harbin, a complex known only by its designation, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The name was deliberately innocuous, designed to deflect curiosity, but the reality behind those bland words was far darker. Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, the facility's commander, received the evacuation order on August 10th. He had days, perhaps only hours, before Soviet forces reached his complex. Ishii was methodical, even in panic. He ordered the systematic destruction of everything that could reveal what had happened here. Buildings were dynamited. Documents were burned in massive bonfires that lasted through the night. Equipment was smashed and buried. The power plant was destroyed. The water system was contaminated to prevent its use, and most horrific of all, the remaining evidence, human evidence, was eliminated through methods Ishii would take to his grave. By August 14th, when Soviet advance units reached the facility, they found only ruins, collapsed buildings, ash piles, cratered earth. The Soviets, focused on pursuing the retreating Kwantung Army, conducted only a cursory investigation before moving on. But Ishii's destruction, thorough as it was, couldn't erase everything. Some evidence survived. Some witnesses lived. And most critically, some documents escaped the flames. 3 weeks later, when American military intelligence finally reached Manchuria as part of the Occupation Authority, they would discover fragments of truth that would force them to confront an impossible moral choice. Scene 2. Captain Murray Sanders, the investigator. Captain Murray Sanders was not supposed to be in Manchuria. A bacteriologist by training and a reserve officer by circumstance, Sanders had spent the war years at Camp Detrick, Maryland, working on America's defensive biological warfare program. His expertise was vaccines and antibiotics, not battlefield operations. But in late August 1945, as American forces prepared to occupy Japan and its former territories, the War Department needed someone with Sanders's unique combination of skills, scientific knowledge, military rank, and the temperament to investigate disturbing evidence without breaking down. On August 28th, Sanders received his orders. Proceed to Manchuria and investigate reports of Japanese biological warfare research. The orders were vague, the intelligence fragmentary. Rumors spoke of a facility where unusual medical research had occurred. Chinese witnesses told stories about prisoners who disappeared and never returned. Soviet officers mentioned finding destroyed laboratories with suspicious equipment. Sanders assembled a small team. Dr. Robert Chen, a Chinese-American microbiologist, Lieutenant James Morrison, an Army intelligence officer, Sergeant Thomas Walsh, a combat photographer, and Corporal David Kim, a Korean-American translator whose family had fled Japanese occupation in the 1930s. They flew to Mukden, now Shenyang, on September 5th, then traveled by military convoy to Harbin, arriving September 10th. The journey took them through a landscape devastated by war. Burned villages, destroyed bridges, refugees trudging along roads with all their possessions on their backs. When they reached the facility site on September 12, 1945, Sanders experienced an overwhelming sense of dread. The complex was massive, over 150 buildings spread across 6 square kilometers. Most had been destroyed, but several reinforced concrete structures built into hillsides had survived the demolition. What were they doing here that required this much space? Dr. Chen wondered aloud. That's what we're here to find out, Sanders replied, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. Scene 3. Behind the steel doors. The main research building stood partially collapsed, its eastern wing destroyed by explosives. But the western section, built deep into the hillside, remained structurally intact. Steel doors had been welded shut from the inside, someone's last desperate attempt to seal away secrets. Sanders's team spent an entire day cutting through the welds with acetylene torches borrowed from Soviet engineers. When the doors finally swung open on September 13th, the acrid smell of chemicals and something else, something organic and decayed, wafted out. They entered cautiously, flashlights cutting through darkness. The facility still had electrical power. Soviet engineers had restored the local grid. So Morrison found switches and harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life. The corridor stretched ahead, branching into multiple sections. Signs in Japanese labeled different areas. Corporal Kim translated bacteriology section, pathology laboratory, production facility, incubation rooms, specimen storage. The first laboratory they entered was approximately 40 feet by 60 feet, lined with stainless steel benches. Equipment covered every surface. Incubators, centrifuges, microscopes, autoclaves, glassware by the thousands. This was sophisticated research equipment, far beyond what military field laboratories typically possessed. This is production-level equipment, Sanders observed, running his hand along a bench. They weren't just studying bacteria here. They were producing them in massive quantities. Dr. Chen had opened a cabinet and gone pale. Murray, you need to see this. Inside were rows of metal containers, each about the size of a thermos bottle. They were labeled in Japanese. Kim translated, his voice shaking slightly. Yersinia pestis, Bacillus anthracis, Vibrio cholerae. Sanders felt his blood run cold. Those were the scientific names for plague, anthrax, and cholera, some of history's deadliest diseases. Are they active? Morrison asked. I don't know, Sanders replied. Rodriguez, get the testing equipment. We need to determine if these samples are still viable. Everyone, protective gear on, now. The team spent the next 2 hours methodically documenting the laboratory while taking precautions against potential biological contamination. Sergeant Walsh photographed everything. Kim translated every label and sign. Chen cataloged equipment. Morrison searched for documents. And Sanders tried to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't defensive research aimed at protecting troops from disease. The scale was wrong. The equipment was wrong. The quantities were wrong. This was something else entirely. In the next room, labeled Pathology Section, they found examination tables with drainage channels and restraints. The restraints were heavy-duty, designed to hold struggling subjects. Specimen jars lined the walls, most empty but some still containing preserved tissue samples in formaldehyde. Dr. Chen examined a specimen jar, his hands trembling. These are human tissue samples. Diseased human tissue. This shows infection by Yersinia pestis, plague, medical autopsies, Morrison suggested hopefully. Look at the labeling, Chen said quietly. Subject 47, Subject 103, Subject 267. These aren't patients. These are experimental subjects. They were deliberately infected to study disease progression. The implications hung in the air. too horrible to speak aloud immediately. Finally, Sanders said what they were all thinking. They were using human beings for medical experiments. This entire facility, it was designed for human experimentation on an industrial scale. Scene 4. The document cache. In a basement level beneath the main laboratories, Morrison discovered a room that had been used for document storage. The Japanese had attempted to burn everything. Ash and charred paper covered the floor. But the fire had been extinguished before complete destruction occurred. Perhaps by Soviet soldiers who had briefly entered the facility. Perhaps by local Chinese who had sneaked in after the Japanese fled. Either way, approximately 60% of the documents had survived. Morrison descended the concrete stairs slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness thick as velvet. The air smelled of ash, chemicals, and something organic that had long since decayed. Each step echoed in the confined space. The basement door hung open, its lock broken. Morrison stepped through and stopped, stunned by what he saw. The room was enormous, perhaps 60 feet by 80 feet, with metal filing cabinets lining every wall. The center of the room was blackened from fire. Mountains of ash rose from the floor like dark snow drifts. But around the edges, where the fire hadn't reached, documents remained. "Captain Sanders!" Morrison shouted up the stairs. "You need to see this!" Sanders, Chen, and Kim descended to join him. Walsh followed with his camera and portable lights. When the lights came on, illuminating the full scope of the room, they all stood speechless. "There must be tens of thousands of documents here," Chen breathed. "This is an entire archive." "Was an archive," Morrison corrected. "They tried to burn it, but they ran out of time." Sanders approached the nearest filing cabinet and pulled open a drawer. Inside were personnel files, hundreds of them, each containing a photograph, personal information, and work history. He pulled one at random. The photograph showed a young Japanese man in a white laboratory coat. The file identified him as Dr. Yoshio Shinozuka, bacteriologist, employed since 1939. "Personnel files," Sanders said. "Everyone who worked here is documented." Kim was examining documents scattered on the floor near the ash pile. He picked one up carefully, its edges blackened, but the center still legible. "This is an organizational chart. It shows the entire command structure. Names, positions, sections. Photograph everything," Sanders ordered. "Every page, every file, every scrap that's readable. This is evidence. This proves who worked here, what they did, and who ordered it." The team worked through the night. They established a system. Morrison and Kim sorted documents by type and date. Chen examined technical materials and translated key passages. Walsh photographed everything systematically, creating a visual archive. Sanders coordinated the effort and made strategic decisions about which documents required immediate translation. As dawn light filtered through ventilation shafts, the scope of Unit 731 began to reveal itself through paper and ink. Personnel records showed approximately 3,000 people had worked at the facility over its operational life. The records were meticulously detailed: education, previous positions, security clearances, family information. Many were accomplished scientists, graduates of prestigious universities like Tokyo Imperial University and Kyoto University. Others were military medical officers. Some were technicians and support staff. All were complicit in what had happened here. Budget documents revealed staggering financial resources. Unit 731 had received funding that dwarfed conventional military medical programs. Equipment purchases, construction costs, personnel salaries, and operational expenses added up to millions of yen annually. Someone high in Japanese military command had considered this program essential enough to fund lavishly, even as Japan's war efforts strained resources. Organizational charts mapped a complex bureaucracy divided into specialized divisions. Division 1, Bacteriology and Pathogen Research. Division 2, Field Testing and Weapons Deployment. Division 3, Water Purification, the only division whose title matched its actual function. Division 4, Production of Biological Agents. Division 5, Training and Education. Division 6, Equipment Development. Division 7, General Affairs and Administration Division. 8. Medical treatment, primarily for staff, not subjects. Each division had subdivi scions, each with specific responsibilities. The organizational sophistication was remarkable. This wasn't a rogue operation or a small extremist group. This was an officially sanctioned, professionally managed military research program. Scientific reports were the most disturbing documents, hundreds of them, documenting years of research in clinical, detached language that made the content more horrifying by contrast. Report 342A, dated March 1943, described experiments on plague transmission. The document detailed how subjects designated as logs, the Japanese euphemism for human experimental subjects, were exposed to plague-infected fleas. The report noted infection rates, symptom progression, time to death, and post-mortem findings, all presented as scientific data. Report 571B, dated August 1942, documented frostbite experiments. Subjects were exposed to extreme cold while various treatment methods were tested. The report clinically noted which fingers and toes required amputation, which subjects died from hypothermia, and which treatments showed efficacy. No acknowledgement that these were human beings suffering, just data. Report 198D, dated December 1940, described vivisection procedures. The report discussed the optimal timing for surgical dissection of subjects with active infections, noting that anesthesia was not used to avoid interfering with physiological responses to disease. Sanders had to stop reading halfway through. He felt physically ill. Kim was translating a report dated July 1944 when he suddenly stood and walked away, his face ashen. Chen, concerned, followed him. They found Kim in a corner, vomiting. "What did you read?" Chen asked gently. Kim couldn't speak for several minutes. Finally, "That report, it described a field test in a Chinese village in 1941. They released plague-infected fleas from aircraft. The report documented how many villagers died, how fast the disease spread, how effective the weapon was. My uncle's village. The dates match. He was there. He might have—" Kim couldn't finish. Chen put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry." They stood in silence. Then Kim straightened, wiped his face, and returned to the documents. "All the more reason to translate everything. These victims deserve to have their stories told. My uncle deserves to have his death acknowledged." Field test reports documented biological weapons deployment against Chinese populations. Report after report described the release of plague, anthrax, cholera, and other pathogens in Chinese cities and villages. The reports evaluated weapon effectiveness, infection rates, and mortality with cold precision. One report from 1942 discussed contaminating water supplies in a Chinese village. Another described aerial dispersal of plague-infected fleas over Ningbo. A third documented the introduction of cholera into a water source serving thousands. Each report represented real people dying horrible deaths. Each clinical notation of mortality rate, 72%, meant hundreds or thousands of individual tragedies. Sanders forced himself to keep reading, knowing these documents were evidence that could bring perpetrators to justice. Equipment, specifications, described the weapons systems developed. Designs for ceramic bombs that could disperse plague-infected fleas without killing them with explosive heat. Spray devices for contaminating water supplies, air filtration systems for protecting personnel while handling deadly pathogens, incendiary devices for destroying evidence if the facility was threatened. The equipment was sophisticated, showing extensive engineering effort. These weren't crude weapons. They were carefully designed systems engineered by skilled professionals. Correspondence between Unit 731 commanders and higher military authority proved that Japan's senior leadership knew about and approved the program. Letters from General Headquarters praised Unit 731's work. Requests for additional funding were approved quickly. Promotions and commendations were awarded to successful researchers. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was official policy. By the end of the third day, the team had photographed over 10,000 document pages. They'd translated approximately 500 key documents completely and summarized hundreds more. They'd compiled personnel lists, identifying over 1,200 specific individuals by name and role. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, devastating. "This is enough to prosecute dozens of people for war crimes," Morrison said. "Maybe hundreds. The documentation is comprehensive. We have perpetrators identified by name. We have evidence of systematic atrocities. We have proof of command responsibility. This is everything prosecutors need." Sanders looked at the mountains of documents, the photographs, the translated reports. He thought about the victims, thousands of them, reduced to experimental subject numbers. He thought about justice, about accountability, about ensuring nothing like this ever happened again. "Pack everything carefully," he ordered. "This goes to Washington immediately. Every document, every photograph, every scrap of evidence. The world needs to know what happened here." He believed documentation would lead to prosecution. He believed evidence would compel justice. He believed America would do the right thing. He was about to be bitterly disappointed. The documents revealed the facility's official designation: Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, Unit 731. The bland name had masked a biological warfare program of staggering scope. Personnel files listed approximately 3,000 staff members at the facility's peak: microbiologists, physicians, veterinarians, engineers, military personnel, and support staff. Organizational charts showed a complex structure divided into specialized sections: bacteria production, pathology, field testing, weapons development, and administration. Budget documents revealed massive expenditures, far exceeding normal military research funding. Resources that conventional military units had been denied flowed freely to Unit 731. But the most disturbing documents were the experimental reports. Written in dry clinical language, they detailed research that violated every principle of medical ethics. The reports described experiments designed to answer specific questions about biological warfare. How infectious were various pathogens when delivered through different routes? What doses proved lethal at different time intervals? How did diseases progress in untreated subjects? Which populations showed greatest vulnerability? How effective were various treatment methods? These weren't theoretical questions. They had been answered through systematic experimentation on human subjects referred to only by numbers. Sanders read report after report, each more disturbing than the last, forcing himself to understand the full scope of what had occurred. One report dated March 1943 described field tests of plague-infected fleas released over Chinese villages. The document coldly recorded infection rates, mortality percentages, and the time course of the epidemic. No mention of the human cost. No acknowledgement that these were real communities being destroyed. Another report from 1942 detailed experiments on cold tolerance, documenting how long human subjects survived when exposed to extreme cold and what treatments proved most effective for frostbite. The clinical detachment made it more horrifying. These weren't seen as people suffering, but as experimental data points. Sanders spent hours reading these documents, his horror deepening with each page. As a scientist, he recognized the brutal efficiency of the research design. As a human being, he felt physically ill. "How many victims?" Morrison asked on the third day of document review. Sanders consulted their translated documents. "The records are incomplete because of the fire. But based on what we've recovered, thousands. Conservative estimate, at least 3,000 dead from experiments. Possibly 10,000 or more over the facility's entire operational period from 1936 to 1945. Chinese civilians comprise the majority, but also Russians, Mongolians, Koreans, and some Allied prisoners of war." Corporal Kim, who had been silently translating documents for 3 days, finally broke. "My uncle disappeared in 1941, taken by Japanese police in Harbin for questioning. He never came back. We always wondered. And now," he couldn't finish. Sanders put a hand on Kim's shoulder. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Dummy Act 2, The Moral Crossroads. Scene 5, Reporting the Atrocity. Sanders worked for 2 weeks, compiling his findings into a comprehensive report. It was the most difficult document he'd ever written, requiring him to describe atrocities in language that conveyed their horror without becoming pornographic in its detail. His final report ran 247 pages, organized into methodical sections. Executive Summary. Unit 731 conducted systematic biological warfare research through experiments on human subjects over approximately 9 years, resulting in thousands of deaths. The facility possessed industrial-scale production capacity for weaponized pathogens and successfully developed multiple biological weapons systems deployed against civilian populations. BOSS. Facility Description. Detailed documentation of the physical plant, including maps, photographs, and architectural analysis of laboratories, production facilities, and support infrastructure. Organizational structure. Based on recovered personnel files, this section identified Unit 731's leadership, staff composition, and operational procedures. Research activities. Clinical summaries of experimental work, documented through recovered reports and physical evidence. Sanders struggled with how much detail to include, ultimately settling on enough to convey the systematic nature of the crimes without gratuitous description. Weapons development. Documentation of biological weapon systems developed, including delivery mechanisms and field testing results. Evidence preservation. Inventory of documents recovered, pathogen samples secured, and physical evidence documented, with emphasis on both intelligence value and criminal culpability. Recommendations. Sanders recommended immediate war crimes prosecution, full disclosure to the Chinese government, and sharing of relevant defensive information with allied nations, while maintaining clear condemnation of how the knowledge was obtained. The report went up the chain of command, triggering intense debate at the highest levels of American government. Sanders was summoned to Washington in early October 1945 to present his findings directly to senior officials. Chapter Scene 6. The Pentagon Debate. The conference room on the third floor of the Pentagon was deliberately intimidating. A massive oak table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs. Maps of Asia covered the walls. Through the windows, a gray November sky pressed down on Washington. Sanders entered carrying his 247-page report, feeling profoundly out of place. He was a captain, a reserve officer, really just a scientist in uniform. The men already seated around the table wore stars on their shoulders and commanded armies, major generals, lieutenant generals, admirals, State Department officials in expensive suits, representatives from the newly formed Central Intelligence Group. "Captain Sanders," a colonel greeted him. "Welcome. Please sit. We've reviewed your preliminary report. The full committee wants to hear your findings directly." Sanders sat, acutely aware of every eye on him. He opened his report, hands not quite steady. "Gentlemen," he began, "in September 1945, my team investigated a facility near Harbin, Manchuria. What we found was evidence of systematic war crimes unprecedented in scope and organization." For the next hour, Sanders presented methodically. He showed photographs of the laboratories. He read translated excerpts from experimental reports. He displayed personnel files identifying perpetrators by name. He described the weapon systems developed and their deployment against civilian populations. The room was silent except for his voice and the occasional rustle of papers as officials examined the documentation he'd brought. When Sanders finished, no one spoke for several seconds. Finally, General Thomas Handy, Deputy Chief of Staff, broke the silence. "Captain, your report is thorough and disturbing. The question before this committee is, what do we do with this information?" "Sir," Sanders replied immediately, "we prosecute. These are clear war crimes. We have evidence. We have perpetrators identified. We have an international tribunal already planned for Tokyo. This should be part of those proceedings." "Prosecution would make everything public," observed Colonel James Wilds from G2. "The research, the methods, the findings, all of it would become public record." "As it should be," Sanders said. "War crimes should be exposed. The Soviets would gain access to everything," Wilds continued. "Every piece of biological warfare research the Japanese conducted would be laid out for Stalin's scientists to study. The Soviets already have access. countered a State Department official Sanders didn't recognize. They occupied Manchuria. They had weeks to investigate before we arrived. They've captured some Unit 731 personnel. We're not protecting secrets the Soviets don't know. But public trials would hand them systematic documentation, Wilds argued. Everything neatly organized and officially validated through legal proceedings. Is that what we want? Dr. Robert Stone, a scientist Sanders recognized from the Manhattan Project, spoke up. Gentlemen, I want to be clear about something. This Japanese research, however obtained, has scientific value for defensive purposes. Data on pathogen transmission, information about infection rates in human populations, details on vaccine development. If we're ever facing a biological warfare threat, this information could help protect American troops. Defensive, emphasized another scientist. We're talking about defensive applications, not offensive biological warfare, which would violate international law and basic morality. Is there really a distinction? Asked a Navy admiral skeptically. Information about how to infect people can be used to learn how to protect people, but it can also be used to infect people more effectively. Knowledge doesn't have morality. It has applications. The debate was picking up speed now, multiple voices overlapping. We need to consider our relationship with China, said the State Department official. Chinese civilians were the primary victims. The nationalist government will expect justice. If we grant immunity to Japanese war criminals who murdered Chinese citizens, the political damage could be severe. Chiang Kai-shek has bigger problems than historical justice, countered a military intelligence officer. He's fighting a civil war against Mao's communists. He needs American support. He'll swallow whatever we decide. That's cynical, shot back the State Department official. That's realistic. General Handy raised a hand, silencing the crosstalk. Let's focus. Captain Sanders, you mentioned in your report that the Japanese scientists are willing to cooperate if offered immunity. How do you know that? Sanders hesitated. Sir, I don't know that personally, but our intelligence assets in Japan have made preliminary contact with some Unit 731 members who fled to Japan. They've indicated willingness to discuss arrangements. So we're already negotiating with them? Asked an admiral. Preliminary discussions only, sir. No commitments made. What exactly are they offering? Complete documentation of all research, full debriefing, exclusive cooperation with American intelligence, and silence. They'll keep the arrangements confidential. In exchange for? Immunity from prosecution, financial compensation, permission to live freely in Japan. The room erupted in competing voices again. Some were outraged at the idea of rewarding war criminals. Others pragmatically calculated the intelligence value. The debate raged for another hour, voices growing heated. Sanders sat silently, increasingly frustrated. The moral question seemed clear to him. Prosecute regardless of intelligence value, but he wasn't making the decision. He was just the messenger. Finally, he couldn't restrain himself any longer. Gentlemen, permission to speak freely? General Handy nodded. Go ahead, Captain. Sanders stood, surprising himself with his boldness. Sir, I was there. I walked through that facility. I read those reports. I saw the evidence of what these men did. They conducted systematic medical atrocities on thousands of people. They deliberately infected entire villages with plague. They performed vivisections without anesthesia. They reduced human beings to experimental subjects designated only by numbers. We're planning to prosecute Nazi doctors at Nuremberg for the same crimes. We're establishing a principle. Medical ethics cannot be suspended even in wartime. Doctors cannot experiment on human beings without consent, regardless of military justification. If we grant immunity to the Japanese scientists, we're saying that principle only applies when it's convenient. We're saying war crimes can be forgiven if the criminals know something useful. That's not justice. That's not what America is supposed to stand for. I understand Cold War concerns. I understand the Soviet threat. But I also understand that how we respond to atrocities defines who we are. We claimed moral authority in this war. We said we fought for civilization against barbarism. If we compromise justice for intelligence, we become what we fought against. The room was silent when Sanders finished. Then General Handy spoke, his voice not unkind but firm. Captain, your moral clarity is admirable and your passion is commendable, but policy is more complex than moral absolutes. This committee must weigh competing interests: justice for victims, national security, relations with China, Cold War strategy, and the precedents we set for future conflicts. Yes, prosecuting these men would be morally satisfying, but it would also expose defensive biological warfare information to the Soviets, damage our intelligence collection efforts, and potentially provide less protection for future American troops facing biological weapons. Your job was to document what you found. You did that excellently. Now it's our job to decide policy. That's not a criticism of you, Captain. It's just the reality of how government works. Sanders sat down, knowing he'd lost. The decision was already made. This meeting wasn't about making a decision. It was about creating a paper trail that showed deliberation had occurred. The meeting continued another hour, but the outcome was predetermined. Authorization would be given to approach Unit 731 leadership with immunity offers. The intelligence would be secured. The war crimes prosecution would be quietly shelved. As Sanders left the Pentagon that evening, carrying his comprehensive report that would never be used in court, he felt a profound sense of betrayal. Not personal betrayal, but betrayal of the victims whose suffering he documented. Betrayal of the principle that justice matters more than convenience. He would spend the rest of his life wrestling with his role in what came next. Der Stee, Scene 7, The Immunity Deal, December 1945, a nondescript office in occupied Tokyo. The room was small, furnished with a metal desk, 3 chairs, and a single lamp. No windows, no decorations. A room designed for conversations that would never officially happen. Sanders sat across from Shiro Ishii for the first time. The general was 53 years old, bald, with a round face and small eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore civilian clothes, a dark suit that had seen better days. He looked like a middle-aged businessman, not the architect of systematic medical atrocity. An American intelligence officer sat in the 3rd chair, present to ensure the interview stayed on track but saying little. This was Sanders's show. He was ordered to debrief Ishii about Unit 731's work, extracting every piece of useful information. General Ishii, Sanders began in English, which Ishii spoke adequately. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Of course, Ishii replied, his voice pleasant and calm. I understand you wish to discuss my research. Your research, Sanders repeated flatly. Is that what you call it? What else would I call it? We conducted medical research under military auspices, research into infectious diseases, vaccines, treatments, and public health measures. You experimented on human beings without their consent. Ishii spread his hands. Captain, war creates necessities that peacetime ethics cannot accommodate. We faced serious threats from biological warfare, both defensive needs and offensive considerations. How could we develop effective countermeasures without human data? Animal studies only tell you so much. Sanders felt his jaw clench. Ishii was talking as if this were a reasonable scientific discussion, not a war crimes investigation. The people you experimented on were prisoners, civilians. They had no choice. They were enemies of Japan, criminals, spies, security threats. In wartime, such people serve where the state determines they're most useful. That's not how civilized nations treat prisoners. Ishii smiled slightly. Captain, let's not pretend civilization survived this war intact. Your country incinerated entire cities with firebombs. You vaporized Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic weapons. Tens of thousands of civilians died in seconds. Don't lecture me about civilized warfare. Sanders wanted to argue that military targeting of enemy infrastructure differed fundamentally from medical experimentation on prisoners. But he recognized Ishii was being deliberately provocative. This wasn't a moral debate. This was an intelligence debriefing. He changed tactics. General, my government has authorized me to discuss certain arrangements. In exchange for your complete cooperation, full documentation of your research, detailed debriefing, and exclusive sharing of information with American intelligence, we can offer certain considerations. Immunity from war crimes prosecution? Yes. Financial compensation? A reasonable amount. Permission to live freely in Japan, to practice medicine, to work in my field? Yes, subject to certain security restrictions. Ishii leaned back, considering. Captain, I want you to understand my position. I believe my research was legitimate. I believe I served my country appropriately. I believe the knowledge we gained has value that transcends the methods used to obtain it. Your government's decision to seek this knowledge rather than prosecute me vindicates my position. You're acknowledging that the information matters more than the moral questions about its origin. Sanders felt sick. Ishii was exactly right. The immunity deal was being interpreted as moral absolution. By choosing intelligence over justice, America was tacitly agreeing that Ishii's research had been acceptable. Don't confuse pragmatism with approval, General. We're offering this arrangement because we need the information. That doesn't mean we approve of how you obtained it. Distinctions without differences, Ishii said dismissively. But I accept your terms. I'll provide everything, documents, data, personal knowledge, strategic assessments, in exchange for immunity and the considerations you mentioned, and silence, Sanders added. You never speak publicly about this arrangement. You never publish or share your research outside approved channels. You maintain absolute secrecy about your cooperation with American intelligence. Of course, discretion is in everyone's interest. Over the following months, Sanders conducted dozens of debriefing sessions with Ishii and other Unit 731 scientists. The information they provided was scientifically valuable. Sanders had to admit that, however much it disgusted him. Data on plague transmission rates in human populations, information about cholera infection routes and mortality, details on anthrax weaponization and dispersal methods, research on vaccines and antibiotics, strategic assessments of biological warfare effectiveness, all of it obtained through unconscionable means, all of it potentially useful for protecting American troops. The moral contradiction gnawed at Sanders daily. In one particularly disturbing session, Ishii described vivisection experiments in clinical detail. Sanders forced himself to take notes, documenting information that might someday help develop surgical techniques or understand disease pathology. But he couldn't shake the image of human beings cut open while alive, their suffering recorded as data points. After that session, Sanders vomited in the bathroom. When he returned, the intelligence officer accompanying him asked if he was okay. No, Sanders said bluntly. I'm not okay. I'm sitting across from war criminals, pretending their research is legitimate science, all so we can get information that might help protect our troops. I understand why we're doing this, but that doesn't make it right. Orders are orders, Captain. That's what Ishii said. He was following orders too. Everybody's always following orders. Nobody's ever responsible. The debriefings continued through early 1946. By March, American intelligence had extracted everything of value from Unit 731's research. The immunity deals were formalized. Ishii and his colleagues would live freely in Japan, protected from prosecution, their crimes buried in classified files. Sanders completed his final report in April 1946 and requested reassignment. He couldn't continue this work. His request was granted. He returned to the United States, carrying secrets he would be forbidden to discuss for decades. When Sanders finished, the questions began. What's the intelligence value of this research? Asked a colonel from G2, Army Intelligence. Sanders chose his words carefully. The Japanese conducted years of biological warfare research that we haven't. They tested delivery systems. They have data on human infection rates and treatment efficacy. From a purely scientific standpoint, the information has value for defensive purposes. Defensive, emphasized Dr. Robert Stone from the Manhattan Project, present as a scientific advisor. We need to be absolutely clear. This information could help develop vaccines and treatments to protect American troops. That's different from using it for offensive biological warfare, which would violate international law and morals. The Soviets are also pursuing this intelligence, noted an intelligence officer. Soviet forces occupied Manchuria for weeks. They certainly captured some Unit 731 personnel and materials. If we don't secure full cooperation from the Japanese scientists, we're handing biological warfare advantage to the Soviets. General Douglas MacArthur's representative spoke. The Supreme Commander is planning the International Military Tribunal for the Far East to prosecute Japanese war leaders. This Unit 731 evidence could strengthen those prosecutions. However, public trials would reveal the biological warfare research to the world, including to the Soviets. A State Department official raised the geopolitical implications. China is our ally and will expect justice for its citizens who were primary victims. How do we explain trading immunity for intelligence? The political damage could be severe. The debate continued for hours, voices growing heated as participants argued from different perspectives. Justice advocates insisted these were crimes against humanity, demanding prosecution regardless of intelligence value or Cold War concerns. To grant immunity would establish a terrible precedent and betray victims. Intelligence advocates argued that the Soviets were pursuing the same intelligence, that national security required obtaining this knowledge, and that the research data could save American lives by helping develop vaccines and defensive measures. Some proposed compromises: prosecute leadership while granting immunity to lower-level researchers, or delay prosecution until intelligence was fully exploited, or conduct secret trials with limited publicity. Sanders listened to the debate with growing frustration. From his perspective, the moral calculus was clear: prosecute war criminals regardless of what they knew. Justice shouldn't be negotiable. Finally, he spoke up. "Gentlemen, with respect, I was there. I walked through that facility. I read those documents. I saw the evidence. What happened at Unit 731 wasn't ordinary warfare. It wasn't even ordinary war crimes. It was systematic medical atrocity conducted under scientific pretense. We prosecuted Nazi doctors at Nuremberg for medical experiments. We established a principle: medical ethics cannot be suspended even in wartime. If we grant immunity to Japanese scientists, we're saying that principle only applies when convenient. I understand Cold War concerns. I understand the intelligence value. But I also understand that how we respond to atrocities defines who we are. We claimed moral authority in this war. We said we fought for civilization against barbarism. If we compromise justice for intelligence, we undermine everything we fought for." There was silence after Sanders spoke. Then a general responded, "Captain, your moral clarity is admirable, but policy requires weighing competing goods. Yes, justice matters, but so does protecting future American lives. The Cold War is beginning. The Soviets are a threat. We need every advantage." The debate continued, but Sanders sensed the decision was already made. Strategic considerations would trump moral principles. The room's power brokers had already decided justice was negotiable. Scene 7. The Immunity Deal. In November 1945, authorization came down. American intelligence would approach Unit 731 leadership with immunity offers in exchange for full cooperation and exclusive access to research data. Contact was established with Shiro Ishii, who had gone into hiding after the war. Through intermediaries, American intelligence made their offer: provide complete documentation of all research, submit to extensive debriefing, cooperate fully with American scientists, and maintain absolute secrecy about the arrangement. In exchange, immunity from war crimes prosecution and financial compensation. Ishii accepted. So did his senior staff. Over the following months, they provided American investigators with detailed information about Unit 731's work, including research data, experimental results, weapons design specifications, and strategic assessments of biological warfare effectiveness. The information was scientifically valuable, no question. Data on human infection rates, information about vaccine development, details on pathogen production and weaponization, knowledge that had been obtained through unconscionable means, but that could theoretically help protect American troops. Sanders was ordered to participate in the debriefing process. He found it deeply disturbing to sit across from men he knew were war criminals, asking them technical questions about experiments that had killed thousands, pretending their research was legitimate scientific work rather than atrocity. In one particularly surreal debriefing session in December 1945, Sanders interviewed Ishii directly. The general was polite, even charming, answering questions with scientific precision. He showed no remorse, no acknowledgement that his research subjects were human beings who had suffered. To Ishii, they were experimental data points. Sanders wanted to scream. Instead, he took notes. The American decision to grant immunity was pragmatic, Ishii said at one point. You understand that science transcends politics. The knowledge we gained, however obtained, has value. Better that you possess it than the Soviets. Sanders couldn't restrain himself. General, do you feel any responsibility for those who died in your experiments? Ishii looked genuinely puzzled by the question. They served a greater purpose. Scientific advancement. Military necessity. War requires sacrifice. They weren't volunteers. They were prisoners. Victims. In war, Ishii said calmly, everyone is a victim. I was following orders and pursuing legitimate military objectives. Your country's decision to seek my knowledge vindicates that position. Sanders realized with horror that Ishii genuinely believed the immunity deal proved his actions had been acceptable. The American decision to prioritize intelligence over justice was being interpreted as moral absolution. Woody, Act 3, Silence and Revelation. Scene 8, The Tokyo Trials. Justice denied the International Military Tribunal for the Far East opened in Tokyo on May 3, 1946. 28 Japanese military and political leaders were prosecuted for war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. The trials would last until November 1948, resulting in 7 death sentences and 16 prison terms. Unit 731 was conspicuously absent from the proceedings. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite thousands of victims, despite documentation of systematic atrocities, no Unit 731 personnel were prosecuted at Tokyo. American prosecutors explained that insufficient evidence existed to bring charges, a lie, since American intelligence possessed detailed documentation and testimony. The truth was that most Unit 731 documents had been classified top secret by American intelligence and were forbidden from use in prosecution. The immunity deals were being honored. Chinese prosecutors at the Tokyo trials were furious. China had suffered most from Unit 731's activities. Chinese prosecutors demanded justice but were overruled by American authorities who controlled the tribunal. Soviet prosecutors also raised the issue, having conducted their own investigation of Unit 731 facilities. But Soviet objections were dismissed, partly because the Soviets had also captured some Unit 731 personnel and were making similar immunity deals. Sanders, watching from the sidelines as a technical advisor to the prosecution, felt betrayed. He had documented war crimes thoroughly, believing documentation would lead to accountability. Instead, his work was being buried in classified files while perpetrators lived freely. In late 1946, Sanders requested reassignment. He couldn't continue participating in the cover-up. His request was granted, and he returned to civilian life, bound by secrecy oaths that prevented him from speaking publicly about what he knew. Scene 9, 40 Years of Silence. From 1946 to the mid-1980s, the truth about Unit 731 remained largely hidden. American intelligence kept documents classified. Japanese officials denied the unit's existence or minimized its activities. The immunity deals remained secret. Some information leaked gradually. In 1946, Soviet prosecutors held a war crimes trial in Khabarovsk, trying 12 Japanese officers captured during their occupation of Manchuria. The trial revealed some Unit 731 details, but Western media dismissed Soviet proceedings as propaganda. In the 1950s and 1960s, scattered references to Japanese biological warfare appeared in academic publications, but always vaguely without specific details about Unit 731 or the immunity deals. Meanwhile, many Unit 731 scientists enjoyed successful post-war careers in Japan. Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959. Others became respected professors, started pharmaceutical companies, or worked in public health. They carried their secrets silently, protected by American intelligence. Sanders, bound by classification and increasingly troubled by his role, avoided discussing his wartime service. He returned to teaching at Columbia University, focusing on infectious disease research, but the memories haunted him. Scene 10. Truth Emerges. The wall of silence began cracking in the 1980s. Several factors converged to bring Unit 731's story to public attention. Japanese journalists began investigating rumors about wartime biological warfare programs. Using interviews with former personnel and document research, they pieced together fragmentary information. Freedom of Information Act requests in the United States started prying loose classified documents. Researchers filed FOIA requests seeking information about Japanese biological warfare and American immunity deals. Chinese government archives began opening, providing victim testimony and documentation of Unit 731's crimes that the Chinese government had collected but kept secret during years of Cold War isolation. Aging perpetrators began speaking, some out of remorse, others seeking to shape the narrative before death. Their testimonies confirmed what researchers had suspected. In 1981, journalist Morimura Seiichi published The Devil's Gluttony, documenting Unit 731 based on interviews with former members. The book was explosive in Japan, selling over 2 million copies and triggering intense public debate. In 1982, American journalist John W. Powell published articles in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists documenting American immunity deals, using declassified documents obtained through FOIA requests. In 1985, historian Sheldon H. Harris published Factories of Death, the first comprehensive English-language history of Unit 731, demonstrating the extent of American knowledge and the deliberateness of immunity decisions. By the 1990s, the full story had emerged. It could no longer be denied. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was consistent. The documents were authentic. Murray Sanders, now in his 80s, began giving interviews for the first time, freed by declassification from his secrecy oaths. In a 1991 interview, he reflected on the immunity deals. "I was there at the beginning. I documented the crimes. I believed that evidence would lead to prosecution. When I learned about the immunity deals, I felt betrayed, not personally, but on behalf of the victims. We had evidence. We had testimony. We chose not to prosecute because we wanted data. That choice haunts me. But I also understand the pressures those decision-makers faced. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet threat seemed existential. They made what they thought was the necessary choice. I just wish it had been different. The victims deserved better." Sanders died in 1995, having spent his final years contributing to the historical record and advocating for acknowledgement of Unit 731's victims. The Mao's conclusion: the price of pragmatism and the power of truth. The Unit 731 story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, morality, and national security that remain urgently relevant today. The original crime was monstrous. Systematic medical atrocity conducted over nearly a decade with official sanction. Thousands died in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. Entire villages were deliberately infected. Prisoners were subjected to vivisection. Human beings were reduced to experimental subjects designated only by numbers. But the American response created a second moral failure, choosing intelligence over justice, prioritizing perceived security over accountability. This decision had consequences extending far beyond immediate Cold War context. The precedent. The immunity deals established that useful crimes can escape accountability. This undermined international law and sent a devastating message. Expertise provides insurance against prosecution. The victims. Denied justice, thousands who died and families who lost loved ones received no acknowledgement for decades. For 40 years, their suffering was classified away. Justice delayed is justice denied. The perpetrators. Ishii and colleagues lived comfortably, some achieving professional success. The immunity deals were interpreted as vindication, allowing perpetrators to avoid psychological reckoning. The historical truth. Suppressed for 40 years, the full story couldn't educate generations or serve as warning. When truth emerged, the immunity deals remained a permanent stain on American post-war policy. Yet we must acknowledge complexity. Decision-makers in 1945-1946 weren't villains. They faced genuine dilemmas in dangerous times, trying to protect American interests. The Soviet Union was pursuing biological warfare. The Cold War appeared existential. Officials believed they faced a choice: secure intelligence or allow it to benefit adversaries. Were they right? We can acknowledge their difficult position while concluding they made the wrong choice. Justice and security aren't mutually exclusive. The Soviets obtained Unit 731 information anyway. The immunity deals achieved questionable benefit at enormous moral cost. Murray Sanders never reconciled himself to his role. In interviews before his death in 1995, he repeatedly expressed disappointment that his documentation led to immunity rather than prosecution. "I thought I was building a case for prosecution," Sanders said in 1991. "When I learned about the immunity deals, I felt the victims had been betrayed. Justice had been betrayed. The principles we'd claimed to fight for had been betrayed. But I came to understand that the people making those decisions weren't evil. They were facing impossible choices. They made what they thought was the pragmatic decision. I disagree with their choice, but I understand the pressure they were under. What haunts me is that the immunity deals didn't achieve what they were supposed to. The strategic benefit was minimal. The Soviets got information anyway. We just compromised our principles for intelligence that ultimately mattered less than we thought." The lesson isn't that people in 1945 were uniquely immoral. The lesson is that moral compromises in the name of security have consequences echoing through generations. What should we learn? First, justice must not be negotiable. War crimes demand accountability regardless of perpetrators' usefulness. When we make exceptions for expedience, we undermine international humanitarian law. Second, transparency matters. The 40-year classification prevented meaningful reckoning. Truth, however uncomfortable, must be confronted. Third, victims deserve recognition. When survivors finally received acknowledgement through museums and documentation, it provided dignity even when legal justice was impossible. Fourth, nations must confront uncomfortable histories honestly. Denial is ultimately unsustainable. Truth eventually emerges. Fifth, medical ethics are absolutely non-negotiable. No data, however valuable, justifies experiments on non-consenting subjects. Today, Unit 731's former facility houses a museum in Harbin. Visitors walk through preserved buildings, see recovered equipment, read victim testimony, and learn history. The museum serves as memorial, education center, and reminder that such atrocities must never be repeated. The American decision to grant immunity remains controversial and should remain controversial. It was a moral failure born of strategic calculation that ultimately achieved minimal benefit at enormous moral cost. The war crime America was never supposed to find couldn't stay hidden forever. Murray Sanders and his team discovered it. They documented it meticulously. That documentation, though buried for decades, eventually enabled truth to emerge. Justice, though incomplete and delayed, was served in the court of history. The victims of Unit 731 deserved better than they received. They deserved immediate justice, public acknowledgement, validation through prosecution. They got none of that in their lifetimes. But we can honor them now by remembering their suffering, teaching this history accurately, acknowledging the moral failures of the immunity deals, and committing to preventing such compromises in the future. Truth matters. Justice matters. Victims matter. These aren't abstract principles. They're moral obligations that can't be negotiated away for strategic convenience, no matter how compelling the immediate circumstances appear. That is the lesson of Unit 731. That is the responsibility this history places on us. That is what we owe the victims. And that is why this story must never be forgotten. The end. This history matters. If this story moved you, subscribe for more important true stories, hit like, and share to educate others. Comment, should security ever outweigh justice? Turn on notifications. The original crime was terrible. Systematic medical atrocity conducted over years with official sanction. Thousands died in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. But the American response created a second moral failure, choosing intelligence over justice, prioritizing perceived national security benefits over accountability for war crimes. This decision had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate Cold War context. The precedent established that if your crimes are useful enough, you can escape accountability. This undermined international law and sent a message that atrocities can be committed with impunity if perpetrators possess valuable knowledge. The victims were denied justice. Families received no acknowledgement. Survivors got no recognition. For decades, their suffering was minimized and hidden. The perpetrators lived comfortably, some achieving professional success. The immunity deals were interpreted by some as vindication, as proof their actions had been acceptable. The historical truth, Sao, was suppressed for 40 years, preventing meaningful reckoning with what had occurred and allowing false narratives to persist. Yet we must also acknowledge the complexity. The decision-makers who chose immunity over prosecution weren't cartoon villains. They were officials facing genuine dilemmas in a dangerous world. The Soviet Union was developing biological warfare capabilities. The Cold War seemed existential. They believed they were making necessary compromises to protect American interests. Were they right? That question has no simple answer. We can acknowledge their difficult position while still concluding they made the wrong choice. Justice and security aren't mutually exclusive. Prosecution didn't prevent intelligence gathering. The Soviets obtained Unit 731 information anyway through their own captured personnel. The immunity deals achieved questionable strategic benefit at enormous moral cost. The lesson isn't that people in 1945 were uniquely immoral. It's that moral compromises in the name of security have consequences that echo through decades. The Unit 731 immunity deals remain controversial today, a stain on American post-war policy that no amount of strategic rationalization can erase. What should we learn from this history? First, justice matters, even when inconvenient. War crimes demand accountability regardless of perpetrators' potential usefulness. The international system of war crimes prosecution exists precisely to prevent security considerations from overriding moral obligations. Second, transparency matters. The 40-year classification of Unit 731 documents allowed false narratives to persist and prevented meaningful historical reckoning. Truth, however uncomfortable, must be confronted. Third, victims deserve recognition. When survivors finally received acknowledgement through museums, memorials, and historical documentation, it provided a measure of dignity even when legal justice was impossible. Fourth, nations must confront uncomfortable histories. The Unit 731 story shows that denial is ultimately unsustainable. Truth eventually emerges. The question is whether nations will honestly confront their past or force truth to fight its way to acknowledgement. Fifth, medical ethics are non-negotiable. The principle established at Nuremberg, that medical research must respect human dignity regardless of circumstances, must be absolute. No data, however valuable, justifies experiments on non-consenting subjects. Today, Unit 731's former facility site houses a museum in Harbin, China. Visitors walk through preserved buildings, see recovered equipment, read victim testimony, and learn the history. The museum is a place of remembrance, education, and moral reckoning. The victims of Unit 731 deserved better than they received in 1945. We honor them by remembering their suffering, acknowledging the historical truth, teaching this history to future generations, and committing to prevent such atrocities from recurring. Murray Sanders, the American investigator who first documented these crimes, spent his final years ensuring the truth was known. In his last interview before death in 1995, he said, "I discovered something terrible in Manchuria in 1945. I documented it thoroughly. I believed that documentation would lead to justice. Instead, it led to compromise. That failure haunts me. But I take some comfort that eventually, truth emerged. The victims are remembered. The crimes are acknowledged. It took too long, but silence was broken. That matters. Truth always matters." the war crime. America was never supposed to find, couldn't stay hidden forever. Truth emerged. Justice, though incomplete and delayed, was served in the court of history. And those who suffered are finally remembered. That is the least we owe them, and the responsibility history places on us, to remember, to learn, and to ensure such compromises never happen again. The end. This history matters. If this story moved you, subscribe for more important true stories. Hit like and share to educate others. Comment. Should security ever outweigh justice? Turn on notifications.